Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm very happy to have a variation on our usual approach for this week's podcast. This past weekend, the Texas Tribune held their annual festival in Austin, and I was happy to be invited to moderate a panel the organizers dubbed Hanging in the Balance this past Saturday, September 24th. The focus of the panel was the competitive elections in 4 states that are very much in the spotlight in the 2022 elections: Georgia, Nevada, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. Today's podcast is a recording of that panel. The folks at the festival did a great job of recruiting 4 great journalists from those states to talk about the dynamics of the election in each of their respective states. I introduced them all at the panel, but they are Greg Bluestein of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Jon Ralston of the Nevada Independent, Andy Chow of Statehouse News Service in Ohio, and Angela Couloumbis of Spotlight, PA in Pennsylvania. These journalists did a great job not only capturing what's happening in their state, but they did it in a really lively manner that was very insightful about the themes running through this election season, and, if you will, the compare and contrast in those themes among their states. I think you'll enjoy it, and here it is. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and start. It's 4:30, and you've been welcomed quite a lot by now. So on behalf of the Texas Tribune, I'm happy to welcome you to the festival and to our panel, Hanging in the Balance. I'm Jim Henson. I teach in the government department at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm the director of the Texas Politics Project, which makes you wonder, why is he moderating this panel then? Nonetheless, I will be your moderator today. So we're scheduled for 60 minutes. Before we all make a massive move to happy hour, we'll talk about politics in 4 states that are in the eye of the storm right now in the 2022 elections: Georgia, Nevada, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. And we'll take some questions from the audience, so be thinking about that. I would hope that the employers I hear are in the room. Don't ask your employees questions now, okay? I say, there's an HR violation at work, I think, if you do that. So let me introduce the 4 terrific journalists who have traveled to be here with us today. I'm going to keep it brief so that we can get to the heart of the matter. You'll find longer bios on all of these folks in the festival material. It's going to be great. We're having a great time in the green room. So to my immediate left, Greg Bluestein is a political reporter and author who covers the governor's office in Georgia politics for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I also want to note, contractually, I believe, Greg will sign copies of his book, Flipped: How Georgia Turned Purple and Broke the Monopoly on Republican Power, at 6 p.m. tonight while we're all drinking at the Festival Bookstore at the Omni, and that is hosted by the American Journalism Project. Next to Greg is Andy Chow, a general assignment reporter, a state government reporter for Ohio Statehouse News. He focuses on environmental, energy, agriculture, and education-related issues. Knows a ton about Ohio. It's great. Next to him, Angela Couloumbis is an investigative reporter at Spotlight, PA. Before joining Spotlight, she worked at the Philadelphia Inquirer, although there was a transition in there in which I suspect there was some overlap. And last, but certainly not least, Jon Ralston founded the Nevada Independent, a nonpartisan, nonprofit news and opinion website, founded in 2017 after a career writing and commenting on Nevada politics via several outlets and platforms. Have it on good authority, he's the second best poker player in his family. So without further ado, I want to ask all of you to kind of orient us to your states by flagging for the audience the marquee races, what's going on in the big races. Give us a sense of where the dynamics in those races are right now. And Greg, let's start with you.
So I'm in Georgia. We like to think, all due respect to my colleagues here, we like to think Georgia is the premier battleground state in the nation, thanks to the 11,000 or so vote margin between Joe Biden and Donald Trump in 2020 and the very close runoffs just a few weeks later that flipped control of the U.S. Senate. And right now, Senator Raphael Warnock, who narrowly won that Senate seat back in the runoff, has to run for a full 6-year term because that was a special election. We also have every statewide office is up for grabs, starting with the governor's race and on down. Stacey Abrams' rematch against Governor Brian Kemp. And what we're seeing right now in Georgia, one of the most interesting things, is a split ticket dynamic. Governor Kemp has a lead in pretty much every poll, but Senator Warnock, Democrat, is neck and neck with Herschel Walker, the former football star, in our U.S. Senate race. And that is because 3, 4, 5% of Brian Kemp voters are also backing Senator Warnock. So we don't see split tickets really anywhere, but particularly in Georgia, and we're seeing that now.
Okay, so I want to push you a little bit because I know other people are going to want to from their state because they're all very proud reporters. Last election very close, as you said. You're a swing state, but how permanent is this? I mean, do we think this is the beginning of something, or what's the argument for it being the beginning of something? What's the argument for us seeing maybe the end of a glitchy period?
Yeah, the argument for this the beginning of something is a few numbers: 8, 5, 1.5, and then 0.1. Republicans won by 8 points back in 2014 and 2016 statewide elections. They won by 5 points. Donald Trump won by 5 points in 2016. Stacey Abrams lost to Governor Kemp by 1.5 points in 2018. And then you had Democrats flipping the state by about 0.1% in 2020. And even if the state becomes a seesaw, and even if Republicans win both these seats that I just talked about and all the down ticket seats, Republicans and Democrats alike consider Georgia nationally and in Georgia premier 2024 battleground. So I take those cues in some part by the operatives who all say the same thing too from both sides of the party.
Andy, what's going on in your state in Ohio? I mean, you've got in your state the Senate race and the governor race look pretty different, right?
Very different. And I would say that maybe Ohio and Georgia have flipped, where Georgia is now one of the more battleground states, and Ohio, which has been considered a swing state for generations, is now becoming more and more red. And I think this next election is going to really tell us if it was a fluke these past couple of years, maybe it was just a Donald Trump effect, or is it really going to hold on? Because we're also seeing the same thing, though. The governor's race in Ohio, there's a wide margin in the polls where the current governor, Mike DeWine, is polling really well against his opponent, Nan Whaley. But the U.S. Senate race is very close. And we're seeing the Democrats sort of take on two strategies here. The Democrats running for statewide offices like governor, attorney general, secretary of state, they're all running with the sort of the normal game plan that Democrats have used for the past couple of years that has proven not to work, but they're kind of running with that strategy. And then you have Tim Ryan, who's running as the Democratic nominee for the U.S. Senate, trying to appeal to Trump voters and trying to make himself sound like a Trump Democrat. And according to polling, it's working. And so we're seeing him polling within the margin of error, while these other statewide races seem like the Republicans are running away with it.
And that strategy kind of underlines the change, right? I mean, you wouldn't be doing that if it wasn't sensing that movement.
Right. And I think what we've seen in Ohio, there are certain regions which were like sort of blue collar labor union Democrats who flipped over to the Donald Trump side. The only Democrat in Ohio to have a proven record to win is Sherrod Brown. And so Tim Ryan is trying to become the next Sherrod Brown and sort of appealing to those voters and trying to bring back who are now Trump voters who were once Democratic voters, and we'll see if it works.
So, Angela, before Greg got to the green room, we were talking about why Pennsylvania is really the most important state this election.
Right.
Tell us about it.
Well, Greg, no offense. I'm just going to read a couple of quotes, and these are not my words. These were written by other, largely national media that have come to Pennsylvania, right? The center of the political universe, the center of political gravity, and lastly, every major American political trend that matters is unfolding right now in Pennsylvania.
That's pretty strong.
Yeah. So, and obviously, I'm sure this does not make me very popular in Texas either, which is also a center of the universe. But in Pennsylvania, we have two marquee races. One is for the U.S. Senate, and it features Dr. Oz, who everybody knows. He's a celebrity heart surgeon. He's running as a Republican against the state's Democratic lieutenant governor, John Fetterman, who is, if anybody has ever seen him or heard him, he's a very unconventional candidate, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. And that race has been billed over and over again as being really important to the balance of power in the Senate. But the second race, and I think in some respects a more important one, is the one for governor. It really is going to determine what kind of state Pennsylvania is going to be going forward. Is there going to be access to abortion? Is it going to be restricted? What kind of access to the polls are people going to have? Because it features the Democratic Attorney General, Josh Shapiro, who has a very long career in politics and a record that's well known and well established. And he's running against a state senator, Doug Mastriano, who is an election denier. He was endorsed by Donald Trump. And I'm going to read one other thing because it was written by the AP, and it kind of sums up perfectly really the importance of it. They wrote that no GOP contender, in talking about Mastriano, did more to subvert the presidential election, and no one may be better positioned to subvert the next one than Mastriano if he's elected governor.
You know, you said we'd get to it later, but let's talk a little bit right now while we've got you on the subject about the Fetterman-Oz race. Because in some ways, of all these races going on, there's, not to take anything away from Mastriano, the personalities conflict between, and not even personality, the persona conflict between Fetterman and Oz is really interesting, and I think it's got a lot of national attention. I'm curious what that looks like from your perspective. I mean, the sense recently to me, looking at the polling and the national coverage, is that Oz was kind of on the ropes. The national Republicans were worried about him. Maybe he's closed a little bit, and it does seem a little bit of an open question about what Fetterman's health is like. Right. On one hand, to be fair and not make people angry, he can recover from the stroke, et cetera, but it's obviously been a factor in terms of how people are thinking about the debate, their apparent resistance to debate, even those other explanations. Talk a little bit more, if you would, about what that looks like from the ground and what you're hearing about that.
Yeah, so John Fetterman, for those who may not know, suffered a stroke a couple weeks before the May primary, and has since been recovering from it. But what that translated to was that he was unable to hit the campaign trail over the summer. And instead of being out and about in the summer, his campaign ran this super sophisticated social media campaign that garnered him national headlines. It made the word crudité popular again in regular circles. And it really sort of, it really captured the fact that he's got this kind of larger than life persona. But Dr. Oz, in trying to navigate the absence of Fetterman on the campaign trail, just really started to hammer him about his health, about him not being transparent about his health. And anybody who's seen Dr. Oz knows he's super smooth speaker. He's very well practiced in front of cameras.
Almost like a salesman.
Oh, totally. And made a really big issue. And even though there is a long tradition in American politics about questioning people's fitness for office, this went right up to the line potentially of hurting him, but it actually, in some respects, also helped in that it forced Fetterman back onto the campaign trail so people can now see him and see how he's doing physically.
And it seemed like it changed the focus of the campaign, not only forcing him back on the trail, but the media, the storylines, the coverage began to focus on that a little bit more, it seemed like.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. That's all it was about. There was very little about issues.
So, John, you have like a couple of really close top-of-the-ballot races, right? in Nevada?
So first, let me say that with the official concession speech tonight, that Ohio is no longer a swing state. I do think that there is very strong competition for second most important state between Georgia and Pennsylvania. So now let me tell you about the most important state and why it is. We do have two very close races at the top of the ticket, one for Senate and one for governor. They're both within the margin of error. There is some evidence that they may be tilting a little bit right now towards the Republicans, but I've learned after too many years of doing this that you don't make pronouncements on September 24th about what's going on. There's a lot more to be done. There are the Senate race in Nevada. Is between Catherine Cortez Masto, who is a freshman elected in 2016 by only 2.5 points, and Adam Laxalt, whose grandfather was a legendary figure in Nevada as a governor and then as a senator. And he would not even be anywhere in without that last name. He actually didn't grow up in Nevada. He moved to Nevada about 10 years ago and ran for attorney general and won in an incredibly close race, one of the biggest upsets in history, then ran for governor right away, lost in 2018, and then became the leader of the election denier movement on behalf of the Trump campaign in 2020. He is essentially hiding. Laxalt is, as some other Republicans are across the country, doing only interviews with Newsmax and Tucker Carlson, and only with the most softball of questions. But this is the kind of year in a purple state where the Democratic advantage that has existed for many, many cycles is now below 3%. There's been a rise of independent registration, and so that race is very close, as is the governor's race between the Democratic incumbent. Both incumbents at the top of the ticket are Democrats, Steve Sisolak and Joe Lombardo, who is the sheriff of Clark County and is kind of a tabula rasa, and that's been to his advantage in many ways when you're running against an incumbent, COVID-era governor, et cetera, with all those issues. Just to make the we matter, we're most important, totally selfish case, all of our statewide offices are up as well. A majority of them on the Republican side feature one strain of election denier or another. And those races are competitive as well. And at some point, maybe we'll talk about how important Secretary of State's races have become. And the guy who's running for Secretary of State in Nevada, who has gotten a lot of national attention for all of the wrong reasons. 75% of our congressional races are also in play. And if you look at the list that inside elections that are, they say there's 25 races that are going to determine control. We have 3 of them. And it's mostly because of redistricting and reapportionment that was done, that essentially the Democrats had to move some Democrats out of a very safe district to try to shore up 2 other ones. So now all 3 districts are in play.
You know, for those of us that have not followed Nevada super closely, step back and give us a little bit about the trajectory. So have you guys had several competitive races in a row? You've got 2 Democratic incumbents. I'm wondering, tell us a little bit about what the movement has been like over the last few elections.
It's been rare for races in Nevada to not be close at the top of the ticket. A couple of times, you have to go back to 2014 when, as only can happen in Nevada, none of the above, which is something people can choose in statewide races, actually won the Democratic primary. And that is really something. Now, the way the law reads is it has no teeth, so the second place finisher goes, but that was a total unknown, and so he got crushed by the Republican incumbent in the room. But since then, the races have generally been pretty close, and we've been a purple state for quite some time. In fact, it looked like maybe we were going to become a blue state after the 2016 cycle, but I think we're firmly purple. By the way, Nevada, for 40 years after LBJ in presidential races, was a red state. And then only when Obama won, and then Hillary and Obama won twice, of course, and then Hillary and Biden won, have we become seen as more of a blue state than a red state in presidential races.
Does that feel a little premature to you? I mean, that's what it sounds like you're saying.
To say that we're a blue state?
Yeah.
It does, although just to have fun with all of my Democratic friends, after the 2016 landslide wins across the board, I declared us to be a blue state, which you would think the Republicans would be upset. The Democrats were upset because they said, no one's going to give us any money now, and we're going to get no outside money if you say that we're blue. And it was a facetious column, but sometimes people take you seriously, even when you're trying to be facetious. But yeah, we're a purple state. Now, again, the Republicans think there's going to be a big red wave. And I don't just mean Republicans who just say that to say that. I mean some smart Republicans I talk to. But there are a lot of X factors out there, and we'll probably talk about one of them, which is the Dobbs case, which has changed the dynamic of some of these races.
I will say that the Republicans are feeling the same way in Ohio, too, where they wouldn't like hearing people say, oh, it's a red state now, because they don't want people to become complacent and everything.
Right.
Well, I think, a lot of things have made it so that the parties don't want you stepping on their fundraising space, among other things. So let's go in that direction. When we had talked about this a little bit, and we'll come back to you, Greg. Angela raised abortion. Talk a little bit about the issue environment. Start with abortion, but I'm interested. I mean, the national kind of overarching narrative, right down to, I think, Political Playbook this morning is that, we're looking at, in most places, some configuration of abortion, the economy, immigration, and then where you can rotate different issues in on the fourth side. Like, what's taking pride of place? And, my view of this is typically the parties are trying to push different issues up front. Obviously, in virtually everywhere, abortion is to the Democrats' advantage. Talk a little bit about what that looks like, what the mixture of those issues looks like in your state.
Yeah, like in other states, Democrats hope abortion will be a game changer for their candidates. And they hope that because, in part, they believe that Georgia's electorate is usually about 55% women. They believe that polls like ours and other polls aren't picking up on the likelihood that the electorate could be 57% women, 58% women. And if that happens, it changes the entire dynamic in a close state like Georgia. In Georgia, we had Governor Brian Kemp, when he ran for office in 2018, promised to pass the toughest abortion restrictions in the nation. He didn't quite do that, but he did sign into law the next year, and it was a huge national story as well as an enormous local story, abortion restrictions that basically ban abortions as early as 6 weeks in most cases. And like many other measures that were passed in 2019, it was even the Republicans who supported that said, hey, yeah, we'll vote for it, but we never think it's going to go into effect. And then, lo and behold, 3 years later, it is now in effect. Republicans in Georgia want to talk about anything but abortion, just like probably in your states. Governor Kemp just had a big headline event with a very kind of far-right Christian conservative group where he mentioned abortion once, right? And then talked about foster care reforms and economic issues and things like that. He will talk about it if I ask him about it on the campaign trail, if a reporter asks us about it, but he will not go voluntarily speak about abortion-related issues. Stacey Abrams, other Democrats, that is kind of the centerpiece of their arguments. They acknowledge the same thing that polls show, which is the economy, inflation, cost of living, is jobs. Those are that's the prevailing factor for voters. But in many polls, abortion is 2 or 3. And what Democrats in Georgia and probably elsewhere are trying to do is tie those threads together. So Stacey Abrams is out there saying Governor Kemp's anti-abortion laws and pro-gun policies are dissuading businesses from moving to Georgia. We had a concert that just got canceled called Music Midtown that usually attracts 50,000 or so people. That got canceled because of Georgia's permissive gun laws. We've had other governors in North Carolina, Democrats, North Carolina and California and New Jersey all make appeals for Georgia businesses based on our anti-abortion restrictions. So that becomes part of her platform as well.
I thought you were going to say they tried to get the music festival.
They did that too. The North Carolina governor did.
It's like that one line you just said was like the trifecta of those 3 issues.
Bringing them all together.
So what does it look? Is it the same everywhere? Does it look the same in your state, Andy?
It does. So I mean, if you were to ask any Democratic candidate in Ohio, they would say the top issue is abortion. But again, with polling, it comes in about 3rd. And so the question is, all right, what is driving people to the polls? Because historically in Ohio, the conservative voters, the Republican voters, they have said in the past that they'll vote for Republican candidates because of abortion. So what happens now that on that Republican side it's not on the table, and on the Democratic side it's the rights that are on the table? And so that dynamic has completely shifted, and you see a lot of people in the political world in Ohio really trying to figure out this new landscape, because everything's just been shifted ever since the overturning of Roe. And so what you see now is, again, trying to roll in the economy, roll in the issues of guns, same sort of things in Ohio. But then you also have the danger for the Democrats is to maybe sort of ignore other issues like trade deals, immigration, which immigration pulls very heavily in that border state of Ohio. And so
you're very close to Canada.
Yeah, and so the other thing that kind of looms around is that the Republican Party in Ohio is very much controlled by Trump Republicans. And so whether the Republicans on the ground in Ohio think that they have a certain winning strategy, it's all thrown out the window if the former president comes in and holds a rally and decides to say whatever he wants to say about things. And again, you see that shift again where somebody like J.D. Vance, who's running as the Republican U.S. Senate nominee, has to sort of fall in line with those talking points that he was trying to avoid. So like what Greg said, I was on the campaign trail with J.D. Vance 1 or 2 weeks ago. He never once mentioned abortion, never once mentioned it. But then later that night at a rally in Youngstown, I'm sure maybe you've seen this video of the rally in Youngstown, which we can get into, but then that is...
Just tell them about the rally in Youngstown. Go for it.
It's nuts.
The rally in Youngstown was something. It was extreme. And at the end, Trump started giving this very bleak description of what America looks like, and there was music playing underneath, and then everybody started to raise their hands in the air, holding up a finger. It was very, can I say creepy? I think it was very creepy.
It was QAnon, right? It was
so then the reporting later, because I wasn't familiar with what the song was and everything, but later in some reporting they said that the music was very similar to QAnon music that's been used in their materials as well. And again, so you have these Republicans on the ground in Ohio sort of pushing out their own message, seemingly working, and then former President Trump comes in and sort of just shakes it all up, and now you have the Republicans sort of scrambling to sort of spin it in their way, and we'll see if that works.
When I was wondering, I think, one of those fourth rotating issues was Trump. So we were talking a little bit. It sounds similar, but with a little bit of a twist in Pennsylvania, right, Angela?
Yes, so both Democratic candidates have made abortion a top issue. It has played out particularly loudly in the governor's race because in Pennsylvania currently the legislature is controlled by Republicans, and there is currently a Democratic governor who's about to finish his term. And that governor has vetoed any abortion bill, any bill restricting abortion that has come to him. So the next governor of Pennsylvania is really viewed as kind of the person who will either block or permit legislation coming from the Republican-controlled legislature regarding abortion. So that is why that issue has been so heavily focused on by the Democratic governor. In the U.S. Senate race, it came up today. John Fetterman was in Philadelphia for a rally, and he made it front and center of his speech. But that race really hasn't been, like I said before, it has not been super issue-oriented up until now, but I'm assuming that we're going to hear quite a bit about it.
So what are Republicans talking about? Are they trying to, when they're not talking about abortion, are they filling the space with the issues these guys were talking about more or less? Anything else more locally kind of flavored?
Yes. So so Doug Mastriano, who's running for governor, has not really permitted press at his events, which really makes it very difficult for us to report on what he's, talking about. But thankfully, he does put it on Facebook Live, so you can see it. He is a candidate who does not run away from his stance on abortion, and his stance on abortion is Ban it at 6 weeks, no exception. And he, on the campaign trail, talks a lot about that. He talks a lot about, a lot of Trump talking points about making Pennsylvania great again, but doesn't really define what that means. And if you go to his website to try and get some insight too into his policies, they're not clear. They're very broad. But there is, one of his big issues is public education and moving money away from funding public education into basically giving parents money to send their kids wherever they want to send them.
I'm curious, how does that poll in Pennsylvania? Because here it's and this is the way geographically Pennsylvania does strike me as potentially similar to Texas, where even though that's an intensely popular issue among some Republican elites and opinion leaders, it actually doesn't work very well in rural Texas, and so it's odd. It's the perpetual issue that's always kind of a loser and not a great campaign issue.
No, it doesn't poll very well in Pennsylvania either, but it polls very well with the wealthiest man in Pennsylvania, who is a very big donor to campaigns. And so as a result, that issue has become front and center.
And we have a similar issue going on in Ohio. In general, public-wise, it doesn't poll very well, but it polls very well for evangelical voters and people who want to send their kids to private schools or to have school choice. And again, we have some well-connected donors who are in that space too.
It's really easy to poll those 6 guys with billions of dollars. I wish they would just ask us to poll them. That's an interesting dynamic. Jon, how about what's the issue universe like in Nevada?
So the abortion issue is front and center in Nevada as well, in the Senate and gubernatorial races, but it's different in Nevada for this reason. In 1990, and yes, I was covering politics in Nevada in 1990.
You were 12.
Yes, exactly. The pro-choice groups in Nevada put on the ballot a referendum to cement the pro-choice 24-week statute into law. And if that were to pass, that would mean that it could not be changed, except by a referendum to repeal it. It passed by 2-1. It was overwhelming, surprised a lot of people that Nevada turned out to be that much of a pro-choice state. And that exists today, of course. It has not been changed. And so what is happening is, I get the feeling you could run into Senator Cortez Masto on the street and say, God, the Raiders are a disaster, aren't they? And she would say, did you know Adam Laxalt is pro-life? That's all that she wants to talk about, literally. That's all now that Governor Steve Sisolak wants to talk about. I've mentioned how close those races are. So what the Republicans finally woke up in both of these campaigns are doing, Sisolak's campaign has done a much better, Lombardo's campaign, has done a much better job than Laxalt's campaign on this. But Lombardo, they both have ads on now about abortion, both Republican candidates. And the one that Lombardo's is politicians are lying to you. They are saying that person can be elected and do something about abortion. That's not true. They're lying. Don't listen to them. It's settled law.
Vote for me, I'm powerless.
Exactly. Something like, don't vote for me, I can't do what I want to do and that you're mad at me for. Laxalt's campaign has taken a slightly different tack. I don't think their ad is as good, but it's, you should be worried about gas prices and inflation and all these other things. Don't worry about abortion. It's settled law, and so nothing can happen. Laxalt's permutations on this are just incredible. He got into politics as super pro-life. Even when the state was pro-choice and the governor was pro-choice, he started filing amicus briefs in other state cases on the side of the pro-life forces, which the governor went crazy about and publicly spoke out. Fervently pro-life as you can. When he was asked about the referendum I referred to in 1990 during his governor's race, he clearly, because as I mentioned before, hasn't lived in this state, had no idea what the question was about, and just answered, "Oh, we're looking into overturning that." That's on tape, and that is being used. But now suddenly he is against a federal ban on abortion. Well, this is the most pro-life guy maybe who's ever run for office. Nobody believes it in the know, but he's trying to get the voters to say, "Don't worry if I would if Adam Laxalt is elected, I will bet anyone here if that ever comes up for a vote that he will vote for it." when he was asked last week by several outlets about Lindsey Graham's bill, they put out a statement. Of course, they never make him available to answer this, saying it can't pass anyway. It's not relevant.
And this was, for most people in this audience probably know what we're talking about. This was Lindsey Graham's proposal, which many of his Republican colleagues felt ambushed by, that proposed a federal abortion law allowing abortion up to 15 weeks, but with draconian penalties. And, so it was a strange kind of play that, made people, I think, hate Lindsey Graham even more in the Senate. But
clearly the polling in Nevada shows for the Democrats that this is a way that they can drive base turnout, that they can get more female turnout than previously has been foretold, because every commercial that they have on now essentially is about abortion, and it's all they want to talk about.
What really surprised me in Georgia, by the way, is while Governor Kemp, when I asked him about that Lindsey Graham bill, he said, I'm not worried about Washington. Asked Herschel Walker about it, leaned into it.
Yeah.
Said, hey, I believe in states' rights, but I would 100% support this federal ban. And in fact, he said this multiple times, but he wants to ban all abortion, no exceptions for anything.
Yeah, I think they're just generally scrambling on the Republican side, I think, at this point, trying to figure out where to position themselves. It's interesting to hear the different variants in your states on this. I kind of want to go back, just start back with you, Jon, and go back quickly. You mentioned, a couple of you have mentioned this notion of how the Democrats in particular are depending or banking on either increased turnout by women that, will vote pro-choice on, or, some variance of against the post-Dobbs abortion reality, or some increase in registration. I'm curious, is there any reliable registration data in your state at this point in the cycle that indicates that? Because I find that looking for that data, most of the claims that have been made on that are a little shaky. What does it look like in your states?
It's pretty. That data is hard to find in Nevada. It's opaque. The Secretary of State's office just does not do that kind of deep dive. Unfortunately, the campaigns, the Democrats say that yes, they're seeing an upsurge, but I'm not sure that it's true. It does seem that the polling shows, poll after poll after poll, and polling in Nevada, for those of you who don't know, has been notoriously bad for a variety of different reasons, that there is an uptick in abortion as being an issue that people care about and that they are going to go to the polls to vote on, which is why these inoculation ads from the Republicans are on the air right now.
Yeah, it's purely anecdotal at this point. We talk to a lot of groups that are on the ground, that are trying to register people. When you're talking to groups that are doing it in big urban centers like Philadelphia, like Pittsburgh, the anecdotal evidence is that they are getting a lot of young voters and a lot of female voters. That doesn't, though, necessarily mean, because I know this is going to be shocking to some people, but not every woman who registers to vote is pro-abortion. And so it's really hard, just even with that anecdotal evidence, to get a true sense as to whether that is going to turn the tide, and for Democratic candidates, and whether it's going to resonate with voters, newly registered voters.
Andy, tell me you have a completely transparent,
well, I was going to say,
an immediately transparent voter registration system in Ohio, and you can answer this question for us.
Well, I was going to say it's interesting to hear that this is happening in other states. We should all share notes more often, because this. Yeah, I'm sorry, Jim, it's not the case. It's the same thing. Well, and so about a month ago, the Democrats, for the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Nan Whaley, they put out a press release and it said, women are pissed. And then they used these new voter registration. But no, I think that they don't have those demographics. They can just show you that there's an uptick in new registrations. Maybe they have some data to show who was already registered, and so there's something there. There's a hope that Ohio, if the Democrats are going to start winning, they need to turn out more suburban voters, more like of those red suburban areas outside of the urban cores, which are blue, and they need to flip those suburbs blue. And they believe that this uptick in voter registrations are coming from those areas. And so, but it's a stretch. It's kind of a Hail Mary.
Suburban women is one of the most enduring election tropes of this century.
Yes.
But in Georgia, it's a true trope, right? Our suburbs,
trope.
a true trope. Our suburbs flipped in 2016 for the first time since Jimmy Carter's era, based on a surge of voting, but particularly among suburban women. We are the anomaly. We actually have that data. But the problem with that data is pretty much everyone who gets a license in Georgia registers to vote at the same time. So we have 1.6 million newly registered voters since 2018. But just as you said, just because you're a woman doesn't mean you're necessarily against abortion. Just because you're a registered voter doesn't mean you vote, right? So it's really hard to tell if this is going to change the electorate at all, because so many of those people will not vote. But generally speaking, the 1.6 million, this is sort of the Democratic fantasy in Georgia right now. This is what's keeping their hopes alive, because those 1.6 million new voters tend to skew younger. They tend to be living in the metro Atlanta suburbs that have turned blue. Some of them are transplants from other states that are blue. So they tend to be Democratic leaning, but again, you got to get them to vote.
And we should give a little bit of love to in case there's a campaign consultant or two in the room. I mean, people model this stuff, they extrapolate, they sell these models to people, but they're models. They're not the actual data.
Jim, let me just give you one more piece of anecdotal, as you were, data on this in Nevada. A few weeks ago, Sarah Longwell, who's the publisher of The Bulwark, who's been doing focus groups across the country, did a couple of focus groups in Nevada and asked primarily about these two races. And I'll just give you two data points from them. Every single person in each of these focus groups, there were 8 people in one and 9 in the other, when asked why they were not voting, how they were going to vote. These are, by the way, Democrats who were open to voting for Republicans. That's how they were chosen. Every single person was against Laxalt. Every single person, and except for 1 or 2, it was because of abortion. That was it. Little different, and that's why there's some crossover. Just like in your state, at the top of the ticket, I think there will be some Democratic Republican splitting, and what that percentage is could turn the race. Not everyone was against Lombardo, but those who were not going to vote for Lombardo cited abortion. So and again, focus groups aren't determinative. They're not polls, but you can pick up trends from focus groups, and I found that to be significant.
Focus groups are the only thing that have people going, "Hey, it's not a poll."
Right. Exactly.
I've done both.
Yeah.
So, which makes me probably a bad person. I want to. You were going to jump in a minute ago.
Oh, I was going to say, you made a good point about just because you're a registered voter doesn't mean that you're going to go vote. And there is, again, the anecdotal information and everything. There was a correlation. There was a big uptick in voter registration right after the Dobbs case. So I think that's another thing that the Democrats were pointing to as like, this is why.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a gray area. I mean, it's not implausible what's going on here, but we also know that we've really misjudged trying to figure those things out a lot in the last few years. And, I think we should all be a little gun shy about that. I mean, skepticism is really in order, even though, it stands to reason. But the closer you look at the polling numbers, the less you see that abortion attitudes have moved. And the salience readings that we get, at least here in some of the national stuff, shows that there's still a fundamental problem that Democrats have that they still haven't gotten away from, even as the parties have gotten more polarized. There's still a lot more heterogeneity among Democrats in terms of what issues they see or they think are most important. And abortion is now number 1 in most of the polling I see among Democrats. But just to use Texas as an example, and Texas is a slightly extreme example, when we ask what is either what is the most important problem facing the state or what is on your mind going into the election, number 1 issue among Republicans, not surprisingly, my old comrade Ross Ramsey and is here. We've been talking about this for a decade. Immigration and border security. We were talking about gambling earlier. One thing I will gamble on is that immigration and border security is going to be at about 50% among Republicans. This time, Democrats, abortion moved up to the top, but only among 22, 25% of Democrats. They've just got all these other things going on among their constituents, and it makes me skeptical about what the mobilization potential and what the upside is.
Well, but the thing that's changed too is that, well, first of all, one thing that hasn't changed is by this point in an election, whether you consider it late or early, there is a lot that's baked in, and people are not going to change their minds. And whether there is 10% undecided, 15%, whatever number in whatever state it is, a lot of that is baked in. What has changed since I first started covering politics in 1986 is the velocity with which information moves and the velocity with which the landscape can be changed. And so I still think there are things that could intercede. I don't know what they are, whether it's something that occurs overseas, it's something that occurs domestically that could affect these undecided voters. I think it's going to be hard to get a lot more new voters to come into play now that are going to vote based on abortion. If they're upset about the Dobbs decision, they're probably already registered and they probably decided which way they are going to vote. But the way that social media works, the upsurge now in digital advertising, which was not a thing, way back in the day, and how campaigns are skillful at using that when they use TikToks now and they use Instagram and all kinds of ways to deliver it. Because there has been an upsurge in youth registration. But are they going to vote? The Democrats think that's great, but is it some of these Republican campaigns are really sophisticated in how they're trying to appeal to the youth vote? So I think while there's a lot that's baked in now, I still think that something could happen to affect these undecided.
Basically, in the artless language of the social sciences, all those forces of stability are there. But what we've seen in the last few political cycles, much higher incidence of what we call exogenous shocks. Just, for regular people, shit happens. Big shit, right?
Well, Jim Comey or Access Hollywood happened,
right.
and supposedly they changed everything.
Or in a more dour sense, in Texas, mass shootings or big foreign crises. Right. Greg, go ahead. But I'm also going to tell you what I want to do so that maybe you can do this. So we're going to run out of time. I want to have people start to line up, make your comment, and then a lightning round. What would you want to say about your state that we haven't gotten to?
I was going to say, when you mentioned TikTok candidates, Jon Ossoff was the first TikTok candidate, and he was all over TikTok. He had all these memes I didn't remotely understand, and my kids did. My 11-year-old was like, but I asked him, I was like, what's with it? How did you follow this? He goes, Bluestein, I just gave it to a staffer. He did everything, and he raised all sorts of money off of it. So, but no, the one point I would make too is the other fundamental problem Democrats have is Joe Biden. And it sounds weird in a state like Georgia and Pennsylvania, both those states put Biden over the top. Just 2 years ago, his approval ratings in our latest poll is 37%. Every other poll has him at high 30s, low 40s. We're seeing Democrats treat that very differently. Stacey Abrams can't run away from him. She tried to be his running mate. She takes credit for orchestrating the blueprint that led to his victory in Georgia. So he can campaign down here. I support his policies. Senator Warnock, he talks more about working with Ted Cruz than he does with, I'm not kidding. He talks more about working with Ted Cruz on a highway bill that would stretch from Texas all the way to Georgia than he does about working with Joe Biden.
That's a real argument that your state is important and competitive and maybe a little weird.
Yeah. So I know all eyes are on the U.S. House. Are the Republicans going to flip it? When you're watching these races during the midterms, just remember that Ohio's congressional districts are gerrymandered. They are gerrymandered. The Ohio Supreme Court ruled that they have violated the state constitution, yet because of all this infighting, the Republicans won a federal case. And so these maps that are going to be used, it gives Republicans a bigger advantage than they're supposed to have based on the state constitution. And that could be really big when it comes to tipping the scales for Republicans, where you could have and should have, based on the state constitution, you would have seen the Democrats have 5 seats, basically gain a seat in Ohio, but you could see them lose 2 seats instead.
That's a great pro tip. So if you're, most of these people will be doing this. So when you're watching MSNBC or CNN and they're up there and they go to Ohio congressional races, you can go to the bathroom and grab something to drink.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as important as the governor's races and as the U.S. Senate races in Pennsylvania, equally as important and sort of a sleeper type of issue is all of these legislative races that we have going on. The first such races after the redistricting that occurred, which was really painful and full of lawsuits in Pennsylvania, but for the first time has created at least potentially more equal districts, and what the impact is going to be on the makeup of the state legislature going forward, which can be as equally as important as who is in the governor's office.
So I alluded to this earlier, Jim. Across the country, Secretary of State's races, no one pays attention to them. They're not that important. They're critically important. We know this from Georgia, for instance. In the last election in 2020, the Secretary of State was a Republican. So only statewide office holder who was a Republican, and she withstood immense pressure from Adam Laxalt and others in the Republican Party to say that Joe Biden's 33,000 vote victory was not valid for a variety of reasons. And she made some fairly strong statements saying there was not widespread fraud. There's no evidence of it. Secretary of State's office, like all the statewide offices, are up this time. She's term limited, so she's not running. The person who's running for Secretary of State is a person who is a QAnon guy, who is a Mike Lindell, acolyte, who has said, for instance, that no one has really been elected since 2006 in Nevada, that it's all been fixed. There's an algorithm or some such nonsense. And I've been pretty good at predicting elections. I probably shouldn't say that I'm the one controlling them. But having said that,
John Q. Ralston.
He's in every. He is ahead in every poll, by a few points. About a third are undecided because no one pays attention. Those focus groups. I'll conclude with this, so you know how scary it is. Both focus groups were asked about the Secretary of State's race. Not one person knew what the Secretary of State did. Not one person knew who the candidates for Secretary of State are. This is frightening stuff. And it could affect 2024 in a very adverse way in a lot of different states if an election denier conspiracy theorist is elected.
I want to follow up on that. Is there any effort, are you guys seeing any national money flowing into that race to try to affect that?
Not much, not enough. And the person who was running against this Republican is a very well-liked lawyer, got the support of the Democratic establishment, has raised a ton of money, both in-state and out-of-state, because of this. And I don't know what the hell he's doing. So I don't know what the strategy is, but they better get out there pretty soon.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah, please.
So
I was going to follow up on that Secretary of State thing, so go ahead.
Okay, so in Pennsylvania, the governor is, the Secretary of State is not elected. The governor appoints that person. And that issue, too, has become a really big one in the governor's race because Doug Mastriano, who's running as a Republican, has said that if he gets elected governor, he's going to get somebody in there who's going to be like-minded. And aside from that, he's going to make every single registered voter re-register to vote in violation of all kinds of state and federal laws. So, I mean, those races are so important, and I am amazed that, post 2020, that those elections aren't front and center,
Right.
Under the spotlight.
Right.
It's a hard thing to make happen with the public quickly, I think.
Secretary of State. So we have a Republican incumbent who's running again, and Trump won Ohio, so there's not as much heat on Ohio. But we also have somebody who's running as an independent, who is a podcaster, a big QAnon person. She once was at a Trump rally, held up a laptop and said it was Hunter Biden's laptop. So she's running as an independent. So we have this Republican incumbent who's more of a moderate, who's been trying to fight off this run from the right, and she's been just led onto the ballot as an independent.
And we're the home of maybe the most famous Secretary of State in the nation, Brad Raffensperger, who was a backbench Republican, kind of nobody lawmaker, ran in a very competitive Republican primary back in 2018. Everyone thought another conservative activist would win, who was a state senator. But Brad waited until the very end, poured money. He's very wealthy. Poured his own money into the race, wins the primary. Kind of was didn't run a very aggressive campaign at all. And was kind of an afterthought until 2020.
All that unpleasantness.
When he famously stood up to Donald Trump's demand to find enough votes to overturn the election 3 days before the January 5th runoff. And, within a week of the November election back in 2020, the entire Republican establishment, except for the governor, but most of the rest of them, including our two incumbent senators at the time, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue, all called for Brad Raffensperger to step down. The entire Trump apparatus was going against him, pressuring him. Our House Speaker and Lieutenant Governor were getting phone calls from Trump and his allies, urging them to call a special session. The governor, of course, was getting the same pressure. And if I had to bet a year ago that Brad Raffensperger about his political fate, I would have thought he wouldn't even qualify to run for office. I thought he was just a sitting duck. I didn't think he had any chance. Not only did he qualify, he beat Jody Hice, a congressman who was along the same lines as your nominees, who said he would have confirmed Joe Biden's victory in 2020 and bought and propagated all the Trump lies about election fraud. He handily defeated him. And every other GOP incumbent who has faced a Trump-backed challenger in Georgia all also handily defeated their Trump-backed challengers. But the weird caveat to that is they're not anti-Trump. These are not, just like in so many of your states, even the Republicans who stood up to Trump still won't say a bad word about it.
Trump is a very difficult friend.
Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the question.
Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I've worked campaigns since 1984, and I cannot recall an election cycle this close, this far along, when there were so many Senate races within the margin of error in all of that time. And I follow polling very closely, and they all show consistently somewhere around 30 to 35% Republican, 30 to 35% Independent, 40%-ish Democrat. How is it, two questions, how is it that we have come to being so evenly split at almost 50%? Where is that split coming? Is it from the independents who aren't really independent? And also, what sort of macro trends do you see coming out of this that could be played out in 2024?
Want to go first? In Georgia, a generic Republican, at least polls show a generic Republican would probably beat Senator Warnock, despite all his talents. But Herschel Walker is not a generic Republican, and also Senator Warnock is not a generic Democrat. He's he is, just as I said earlier, he has kind of had that maverick sort of unique strategy to attract independent voters. He's running a very smart campaign. And Herschel Walker, with his blunders, his lies, his past history of violent and erratic behavior, all these issues that are now front and center in Georgia. We've been covering them for a year and a half, but now campaigns are spending multi-million-dollar budgets putting that on TV, has changed the dynamic. So I guess that's my answer to why things are so close in Georgia, because if it was a generic Democrat versus a generic Republican, it might not be this close at all.
Since 2016, I've always wondered if it's Trump who gets people to vote for Trump, or if it can be anybody who emulates Trump. So is it only Donald Trump that can get a certain amount of voters to vote for him in Ohio? Or can it be somebody who's pretending and replicating him? And what we've seen in Ohio is that you can't just be like a carbon copy of Trump. You have to be your own person. And so if Trump were to run in Ohio, it'd be easy. Other Republicans who try to pretend to be like him, it's not so easy. And we're seeing that with J.D. Vance right now because he tried to be just a carbon copy. And I think that's where you're seeing this identity crisis in Ohio, where Trump was able to flip very specific regions, again, these blue-collar labor union Democrats in the Mahoning Valley, where Youngstown is, in Dayton. And you see these Republicans trying to regain that strategy somehow. And it has worked in the past. It might not. And I think for some reason, it's only in these Senate races. Because, again, with our statewide races, the governor and down, the Republicans are winning easily. So I don't know if when voters go to the polls, they're thinking of Ohio as one thing and Congress as another. That'd be nice if they were thinking that deeply about it. But I think that maybe is where it's concerned, too, is that maybe they're really specifically thinking about Trump when they're voting in the U.S. Senate race, and maybe they're thinking about other things when they're looking at these other races.
Yeah, really, it's a combination of what they said here, because in Pennsylvania, Democrats, in terms of registration numbers, have an edge over Republicans, right? So what happened in 2016 was that the entire, it used to be, the thought was that in order to win Pennsylvania, a statewide election in Pennsylvania, you had to win big in the Philadelphia suburbs, which tended to trend moderate Republican. Well, that whole scenario flipped in 2016 and has remained that way since then, and it's complicated because in Pennsylvania, in primaries, independents are not allowed to vote. So you get the most extreme candidates, the most, on both sides, if you'd like, and they do well in the primaries. And then when it comes down to the general election, these candidates no longer fit the mold of winning, certain areas of the state. And the best example of that is the current, the person running for governor in Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano. We've talked to a lot of Republicans in the Philadelphia suburbs who just say, I can't vote for him. He's not my brand of Republican. And so maybe I'll sit it out, and maybe I'll hold my nose and vote for the Democrat. And it's the same thing that you were saying in up in the northeastern part of the state, which used to be, it's primarily white working class, used to vote Democrat, but that region went really hard for Trump. So it's a combination of, the type of candidates who are not, the candidates that the pre-2016 candidates, as I like to call them, and just the in Pennsylvania, the inability to really get independents more into the mix in choosing those candidates for the general election.
You're really determined to have Mastriano be the craziest candidate we talk about, no matter what everyone else.
I don't think he is, though.
Is that right? Oh my God, that's even scarier if he doesn't.
You're Secretary of State.
I meant in the major races. No one's crazier than Jim Marchant in Nevada. So generally, as I said earlier, the major races, governor, Senate, when they're up in Nevada, they're generally won by moderates. Nevada has been a purple state for some time. Democrats have had a slight advantage, but extreme candidates on either side generally have not won if they have been the nominee of the party. The independent vote has varied from election to election, generally based on which party is doing well or which issues are prominent. It's a real wild card this time more than it's ever been, and I'll tell you why. For the first time since I've covered politics in Nevada, independent or non-major party voters are the plurality. They have more registered voters now than Democrats or Republicans. But, and Greg alluded to this earlier, the reason that that's occurred, the main reason, is they passed a motor voter law a couple sessions ago. So if you don't register there, they default you to nonpartisan. So there's been this explosion of nonpartisan registration. But how many of them are going to vote? How many of them even realize they've been registered to vote? And the party and the campaigns that are smart enough, because Mark Mellman, the Democratic pollster, once said to me, there's no such thing as an independent, John. There's something else, and they're hiding behind being an independent. Which parties, which campaigns are skillful enough to find out who these new independent voters are and which ones they want to turn out are the ones who will win elections. And it's very difficult, especially for a guy who likes to predict election results, to figure this stuff out.
Yeah, that independent factor is really important. You know what? I have a lot of thoughts on this. We're out of time. I'm going to land this baby. Jon Ralston, Angela Couloumbis, Andy Chow, Greg Bluestein. You know what? This was the most important panel of the conference. Right. Give them a hand.
I agree.
Thank you, guys. It was great. All right, that was still fun the second time around. I hope you enjoyed it. As you follow the 22 national election, I urge you to follow Angela, Andy, Greg, and Jon on Twitter and to read their work on the web. They're obviously great reporters that have a real deep understanding of what's going on in these crucial states. If you're listening via one of the streaming services that carry this podcast, you'll find social media links for these guests, linked to their bios and their work, and even a photo of what the event looked like in a blog post at the Texas Politics Project website. And that's at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Just follow the link through the polling section to the blog. You got to click a couple times, but it's not that hard to find. I want to thank them again for such a memorable and very fun panel. And thanks to our friends at the Texas Tribune for providing the audio file from the panel, and more largely for organizing another great Texas Tribune Festival in Austin. They generated a lot of news that you've probably read about elsewhere over the weekend. Among those friends who helped us, I want to give a special shout out to Natalie Choate, who is the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Tribune, a UT Austin graduate, and in particular, an alumnus of the Government Department and the Government Department internship program. And thanks as always to the excellent professional and student staff in the audio studio and the liberal arts dev studio at UT Austin, who worked on short notice to put the podcast together. We had to do some sewing together to make this happen. You all are just great. Thanks, guys. And thanks to all of you for listening. And we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.